I'm delighted to be joined by MMA legend Randy Couture. I want to go through your entire career. Before you even got to the UFC, you were in the army, you had the rank of sergeant. So, can you tell me a little bit about that time of your life and the stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, I joined the Army in 1982. I got married very young. I had a kid on the way. I needed to find a way to support a family, and the Army allowed me to do that. Thought wrestling was done for me at that time. Family and kids and all of that responsibility. So little did I know, my first duty station would be in West Germany, Hanau, West Germany, and I ended up back on a wrestling mat. There were 5 million soldiers stationed in Central Europe at that time, in the peak of the Cold War. Wrestling and boxing certainly were two huge sports for the Army, and I ended up making the All Army Wrestling team. Won a couple U.S. Army Europe championships and an inter service championship or two, and then ultimately qualified for the '88 Olympic trials as a soldier, wrestling Greco. Um, that got the attention of a lot of college coaches. I never got any love really out of high school. I was a one-time state champ from Washington. I grew up in Seattle, so didn't really get any scholarship offers. And now here I am, an alternate on the '88 Olympic team as a soldier wearing the uniform. So at least college coaches started calling. They found out I had 4 years eligibility, and what was I going to do? Was I going to stay in the Army? Was I going to get out and get my education? It was a big decision for me, for sure. By that time, I had two kids. I'd been married for a while, and that was a big decision to leave the security of wearing that uniform and regular pay, and still chasing that dream of making the Olympic team. Was I going to get out and go to college? How was that going to work out as a 25-year-old in the university? And so it was kind of a scary time, but I charged ahead, and it was a great decision. I'm glad my coach encouraged me to leave the service and go get my education. It worked out.
It most certainly did work out when you look at everything you achieved. I mean, going into the UFC, that's usually a goal that people have for years and years and years. They build on their MMA career, and it's several fights before they get the shot. Your debut was in the UFC, wasn't it? Against a guy who was way heavier than you. Can you recall that? What was it like when you saw him and he was so much bigger?
Yeah, well, this sport was a fledgling sport still back then in the early '90s. It started in the U.S. market in '93. I didn't find the sport or see the sport really until '96, and then had a friend put me on the put submit an application to get me into the UFC, and they put me on an alternate list. This was in late '96, and then spring of '97 rolls around, and I'm getting ready to go to Puerto Rico and compete for the national team in Greco at the Pan Am Championships. And I get a call from the UFC. Hey, we got a spot in the heavyweight tournament in 3 weeks. We're having trouble filling the spot. Somebody got hurt. Do you want to fight? You're on our alternate list. And I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. They're literally on a whim. I had my first fight 3 weeks later, coming back from Puerto Rico and wrestling in the championship. Stopped in Atlanta, spent 5 days on the ground in Atlanta trying to figure out what this crazy jujitsu thing was all about and what these guys were doing on their backs and all this stuff that was so foreign to me as a wrestler. Um, and then rolled into UFC 13 and had two fights. I fought twice that night in the heavyweight tournament. The first one was against Tony Halama, big Finnish guy, 300-pound boxing guy from Finland, and he'd done some pro wrestling. And then the final fight was against Stephen Graham, who was another great big guy, 290 pounds, just a huge guy. Was managed to be successful in both those fights, and that got the ball rolling. They immediately wanted me to fight in a super fight against Vitor Belfort in just a couple months, and that forced me to make a decision. I was a college wrestling coach at the time at Oregon State, and the head coach wasn't too keen on the fighting. He thought it was bad for wrestling and bad for the university, and so he kind of forced me to make a decision when they're throwing that next Belfort fight at me, and ultimately the winner of that fight was going to get a shot at the title. So it was a pretty big deal, and he kind of forced me into an ultimatum: was I going to be a wrestling coach and continue wrestling and coaching, or was I going to be a fighter? And they were paying me more for that one fight than he paid me for the whole year as a wrestling coach. So it was kind of a silly question, to be honest. I loved coaching. I loved what I was doing, but this was an opportunity for me to train full time, immerse myself not only in the sport of MMA, but was still trying to make the Olympic team at that time, going into the 2000 Olympic Games in Sydney. So, you know, I was able to support my family and be a full-time athlete, and that you know, again, that's a pretty big deal too. So.
It most certainly is a big deal. I mean, you mentioned Vita Belfort there. You've got so many big wins on your resume. It's ridiculous, from the Liddells to the Ortizes. What is your favorite rivalry, favorite victory, and what's the favorite story you have from your career?
Well, I think one of my favorite fights has always been the Tim Sylvia fight. You know, that was the biggest crowd we'd ever had at that time, over 22,000 people in Nationwide Arena in Columbus, Ohio. Amazing crowd. Tim, obviously, the huge guy, and you know, most people at 43 thought I was crazy coming out of retirement to fight Tim for the heavyweight championship. And again, you know, like the Belfort fight, like the Liddell fight, like the Ortiz fight, nobody gave me a snowball's chance in hell of winning those fights. They were pretty sure I was going to get my butt whooped, and it just didn't go that way. So that was one of my favorite fights. That crowd was incredible. There was a whole bunch of reasons why that fight was one of my favorites. My age, you know, again, everybody counting me out. I'm glad it went the way it went. That's probably the closest I ever came to that one punch knockout, knocking Tim down in the first, you know, 25 seconds of that fight. But I'm glad it went the distance, because everybody thought I was out of shape and old and shouldn't be in there. And so to have it to be a grinder, I thought was a statement as well. So yeah, that was definitely one of my favorite fights. But those other ones I mentioned all kind of set the tone for my entire career, because I was 33, almost 34 when I started fighting. Most people already thought I was over the hill and that I shouldn't probably be doing it.
I mean, what you did was amazing. A fighter, I suppose, in a similar situation to you, Francis Ngannou, started very late in life. He obviously has his incredible story. He's had his massive comeback in the PFL, picked up a fantastic victory against Renan Ferreira. What did you make of his performance? And also, what do you make of the situation with Dana White that's going on with him at the moment?
Um, well, his performance was stellar, and I, you know, everybody looks at the punching power and the knockouts that he's had, and why did he come to Extreme Couture to develop that part of his game, the wrestling, and you know, in the first fight with Stipe, he got taken down and he got smothered, he got floated over and rode out, ground out basically, and he didn't want that to happen again. So we have a wrestling oriented gym. He came to us specifically to shore up that part of his game, and he certainly showed that in the Renan Ferreira fight. That was a beautiful double leg takedown, going the hard way, going against his head, but he managed to secure the takedown against a very big, very athletic guy, and that, I think, surprised a lot of people. That was his approach. They thought he was going to come out and try and step in the pocket and show off his boxing and his power and try to knock Renan out. That's a dangerous approach to a guy that size, that big. I know that full well. Stood in front of Tim Sylvia, Brock Lesnar, a lot of great big guys, and you don't want to do that. So I wasn't surprised, but I was very happy for Francis. Obviously, it was a very emotional night after the loss of his son from back in April. And I think the whole event brought some closure, not only to the team, but to Francis and Francis's family, dedicating that fight to his son, Kobe. So yeah, I almost lost it in the booth myself. It was very emotional.
Yeah, it most certainly was. And it's great to see him back on top of the world. And he's in a division where there's sort of three names who really stand out. When you've got Ngannou, you've got John Jones, you've got Tom Aspinall. Do you think Francis Ngannou's on top of that pile? Where do you rank those three guys?
I think those are all three of the top guys in the weight class right now. Obviously, a lot of questions about Tom. He's just stepping onto the stage and just kind of coming into his own, in my opinion. I think he's got a very, very bright future. He's very, very tough. I got to meet him last year in Manchester at an expo, and he was super nice, super gregarious, seemed like an articulate, smart guy. And this is a thinking man's game. He's going to figure it out. He's got some great coaches and some great teammates around him that are helping him sharpen all the right tools, and he definitely brings his A game every time he steps up in there. Um, you know, those three names for sure, and obviously two of them are tied up in the UFC, so we're probably not going to see that crossover. You know, unless something changes in our sport in the near future. The sport's very anti-competitive right now with the indigenous contracts that tie up fighters and don't allow any crossover. That's why I think the champs versus champs, Bellator versus PFL fight was so interesting. Those are the kind of fights the fans have wanted to see for a long, long time. So hopefully we see more of that stuff, more of those crossovers, interpromotional type fights, and let the athletes settle things and establish real rankings outside of the promoters. That's the way it's supposed to be done. So those guys are, chirping, making some noise about fighter pay, about the state of our sport and some of the issues in our sport, and I think that's important too. Obviously, the class action lawsuits on the cusp of being approved by a judge and settled, at least the first half of that, after 10 years of digging around and mucking around in that whole thing. So it's an interesting time in the sport for sure. Sport's grown and become a global combative sport for this generation. It used to be boxing, and now I think it's MMA for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up the super fights thing, because Ferreira versus Bader is really what made Ferreira into a bit of a star. And in the UFC, we've got Jones and Miocic, not necessarily the fight fans want to see with these Aspinalls and Ngannous. And make no mistake, Stipe is obviously a legend of the game, but potentially not in his prime. What do you think of the fight?
Well, I still like the fight. I think Stipe's still got a lot of fight left in him. I'm not one to put numbers on anybody. Stipe is more than capable of handling himself, getting himself. John Jones hasn't fought in over 2 years either. So I mean, you want to talk about ring rust and who's come over the top and on their way down. I think you can make a case for either one of those guys in that regard. But they're both very capable and very dedicated athletes. So they'll be in great shape. They'll bring their A games, and that'll be an interesting fight. It really will. I think John Jones may have to use some of his wrestling ability. He gets away with not using that much, but Miocic is going to challenge him for sure, and make him probably have to use some of that wrestling and some of those wrestling situations. So that'll be interesting in my mind.
I think it certainly will. And now I've got to ask you, you've got the gear on, you've got the Affliction. Can you tell me all about this? It looks cool on you, but tell me about your
Yeah,
involvement
this
in this
is a
project.
retro, kind of a throwback shirt. Affliction's kind of making a comeback right now with the younger crowd. That's why I threw the shirt on. I've been an Affliction guy for a long, long time. I think 05, 06, when I moved to Vegas, was when I met Tom at an appearance up in Sacramento, and he was throwing out shirts like crazy out of the back of his Durango, and he gave me a few shirts, and I'm like, man, these are really cool. I love the graphics. And it's like, well, you got a big fight coming up with Tim Sylvia, don't you? Let's make a shirt for you. And that was what opened this whole thing up with me and Affliction, which ultimately led to the creation of the Extreme Couture line of clothing. Through that relationship, they manufacture and distribute my clothes through extremecoutureclothing.com as well. So we've had a very, very strong relationship for a long, long time now. Been a brand ambassador for them. My very first walkout shirt with them was for the Tim Sylvia fight, with the two skulls facing each other, and they couldn't sell those shirts fast enough. It was crazy. So, obviously ultimately led to me having my own line, the Extreme Couture clothing line. I think at one point we were sponsoring over 30 fighters in the sport, and kind of giving back and giving opportunity to some of the athletes to make some money through those sponsorships. So it's been something I've been proud of. It's been a great relationship with Affliction. That's changed and morphed over the years, but it's still intact. And they sent me these shirts for this new kind of resurgence with Affliction and the graphics and everything. They're really cool. It's a really kind of an old school shirt.
I mean, it's great that you've got this opportunity to work with Affliction. You've had T-shirts made for yourself. You've now got your own line of clothing that's able to help out fighters. Do you ever get the opportunity to ever design clothes yourself? Do you have any ideas that you're ever able to pitch to Affliction and get involved in that way?
Well, I mean, yeah, we had the idea. Obviously, the name Extreme Couture, and couture is a name in fashion anyway. I've known that since I was a boy. So, Todd Beard, one of the old founders and original owners, like, man, I love the name of your gym. He was coming to Vegas to give me my first royalty check from those walkout shirts with Tim, and is standing in front of my gym looking at Extreme Couture on the front of the building, like, man, I love the name of your gym. We should do a line of clothes. And I already had, those categories. And so I assigned my, not patents, that's not the word I'm looking for, but I had registered trademarks in Extreme Couture and clothing and a couple of other categories. So I assigned my trademark to that partnership, and we were off and running, making some Extreme Couture clothes. Pretty crazy. Walking down the studio walk, my very first fight against Pedro Hizzo in Las Vegas. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, walking to the arena, and I walk right past a store called Juicy Couture, full of tracksuits. And that light bulb went off in my brain, like, wow, look at that. There's my name on a clothing store. And that was kind of when I started connecting the dots and realizing as a fighter, I'm building a brand, and that I should probably try to take care of that, and went out and got some trademarks in some different categories. And, and the gym was just coming online at that time in Vegas, and the Extreme Couture name and all that. So it was an interesting progression for me as an athlete to kind of have that light bulb go off and recognize that I was maybe missing the boat. Needed to continue to foster this brand and this platform that I'm building through fighting.
I mean, it's great that you're involved in clothing because you've got so many different talents that you've been able to explore in different ways, from when you're in the army, from wrestling to fighting. You can also act. So can you tell me potentially the favorite role you've ever done? And my mom is a massive Jason Statham fan, and I know that you were in Expendables. So can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to act with Jason Statham?
Yeah, Jason's a great guy. I love Jason. I've got to spend a little time with Jason outside of being on a set or involved in a film, and he's just a great guy, very gregarious, funny, fun guy to be around. Obviously, a very talented actor himself. And Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is one of his first films with Guy Ritchie, and put him on the map. And he's arguably one of the biggest action stars in the industry right now. So felt definitely one of those pinch me moments to be involved in Expendables 1, and have that whole cast of guys come together. We're synchronizing our watches at the tunnel and even the crew on the set was a buzz that night because it was just such a unique group of people to bring together in one film, and only Sly could pull that off. He's a great guy, very smart man, and a fun guy to work with and work for. I've had a blast with those movies. Certainly the biggest property I've been connected to has been the Expendables, 1 through 4, and hopefully we'll get to make a 5. Who knows? But I think Scorpion King 2 is a really big film for me. That really kind of put me on the stage, so to speak, where people looked at what I was doing and said, "Oh, he's not just an athlete trying to act. He can actually carry a role and be in a big film and do some of this stuff." So that was certainly a pivotal one for me. My very first one was Cradle to the Grave. The UFC called me, Chuck, and Tito, and asked if we wanted to be in that movie. It was some underground fight scenes, and they wanted some authentic fighters for those roles. And had one line in the movie, and Chuck and Tito actually fought each other in that movie. And that was a couple of years before they actually really got into the cage and fought. So it was pretty interesting.
I can imagine. And you've also made an appearance on Impractical Jokers with Sal. I know that was funny. That was very funny. So for people who've not seen that, tell me a little bit about what you had to do to Sal and how the whole thing came about.
Well, it's what Sal had to try to do to me that was what was important. What a great show, and what a great group of guys. They're authentic. They're real friends. They've known each other forever. And the concept of the show literally came out of their sense of humor and their relationship with each other. So it was really fun. Obviously, he lost in that episode. Whatever their competition was, he was the one that came out on the short end. So now he's got to do embarrassing things, right? They put him in a class of Krav Maga students, and he has to teach the Krav Maga class. So he doesn't even know how to spell Krav Maga, let alone teach Krav Maga. And of course, they got earbuds in our ears. So they're kind of egging you on, like, "Oh, you got to say this, you got to do this." And then, of course, he's in the middle of trying to BS his way through teaching a Krav Maga class and Magaing, as he keeps saying, "Oh, you got a Maga." Like, what the hell does that even mean? And they asked me to walk in as the kind of surprise guest. And then they start chirping and telling Sal, "You got to pants Randy. You got to take Randy's sweatpants off." And so Sal has to come after me and try and take my pants off. And that's basically what the whole episode was about, was him trying to get my pants off and me basically humiliating him, out wrestling him And then ultimately they're like, just take your pants off and throw them at him. So I take my own pants off and throw my sweats at Sal at the end of the episode. It was really fun and really funny.
It is funny that, because that looks completely improvised by you, but I suppose that's the whole genius of the show. But somebody else
Exactly
who's
right.
sort of renowned for being a bit funny within the world of combat sports is Jake Paul, obviously involved in the PFL. He's got the Mike Tyson fight. What do you make of that?
I mean, it's interesting seeing the training footage of Tyson and having been around Tyson in the last few years with the PFL and here in Vegas. I mean, it's a more settled, more grounded, uh, more self-actualized Mike Tyson at this stage of his life than even I think when he was in his peak in boxing. His wife and everything going on in his life is all positive. He's I think more grounded and in touch with himself than he's ever been, and he's still physically very very capable. So what's intriguing to me about that is there a no knockout clause in that contract? That's the rumor that's floating around, that Jake is kind of loading these contracts and making it, skewing it a little bit, which is interesting. And I don't know why Mike would sign a contract like that. I mean, what was Mike known for? Knocking guys out. And if Jake Paul wants to step up and fight Mike Tyson, then you can't put a clause in a contract like that. Let Mike do what Mike does and deal with that. I mean, that would be interesting to me. Though, Jake Paul is certainly poking Dana in the chest about fighter pay with all these crossover matches with Tyron Woodley and Ben Askren and Anderson Silva. And so many of those guys have made way more money in those single boxing matches than they've ever made in MMA. And if Jake Paul wants to shine a light on that disparaging difference in our sports, then you got to get behind a guy like Jake Paul. It's certainly what I took on when they bought the company in 2001 and then later down the road in 2005, 2006 with regard to ancillary rights and the way the sport is being handled by the biggest promotions in our sport. So we have some work to do there as athletes to get our fair share and to stand up for ourselves and unite and demand some minimum treatment, some 401k, retirement stuff would be great. Some health insurance stuff would be great. These are all things that are lacking in this sport. Most of the athletes are taking home, under 20% of the take from any single event. Show me another sport in our society where that's the case. I haven't broke down the math with the PFL. I know they're paying the fighters pretty well. They're trying to do a better job. They're giving the fighters a voice and how they're regulated and how they're managed. Through the PFL. They've created a meritocracy, at least at the global level, where it's all about going in that cage and scoring points to secure your position in the playoffs. If you want to talk smack and play those psychological games, that's on you, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You still have to score points. So, and I love that meritocracy. I mean, that's one of the things I really enjoy about the PFL and the format that they've set up, putting it in a true sports format with a regular season and a playoff and a championship every year. We know that from every other sport, and paying the fighters better, giving the fighters a voice in their regulation and how things operate. I think those are all positive steps and great examples for other promotions in the sport. But that being said, we still have a long way to go to get where we need to go, to get where we need to be, and where the athletes are kind of getting their fair share and their fair shake of what's going on in our sport.